Niórua, from the Gaelic Niórua, itself simply a name for what we know as Norway, a land of beauty and bleakness in equal parts. Though certainly not bereft of intrinsic value, its inhabitants regardless always come to peer outward eventually. The Vikings, the Hansa, or as we'll see here, the descendants of Celtic invaders. In this series, we will explore how our land evolved from squabbling Norsemen to the largest empire in history. This is not a series documenting the history of our own timeline. All events described henceforth, unless explicitly stated otherwise, belong to an alternate timeline in which history develops differently beginning in the late 700s AD. Episode 1, Norse Era, from the Divergence to 933. At the timeline's divergence, Norway was a scrambled mess of petty kingdoms out for themselves, shielded from the more complex politicking in Sweden by the mountains that separated them. Norway was not keen on interfering with such matters. Some southern petty kings traded with Denmark, but usually they mounted their own raids, often targeting France, Spain, or the British Isles, but rarely the Rus or Byzantium, as Sweden stood between them, and also began a tenuous alliance with both beginning in the 790s. Every petty king in Norway was the head of his tribe, with each tribe having history going back to the Germanic migrations, but every region was typically governed as a loose democracy where several tribes stood and held power, though nonetheless strength was valued above all else in a leader. The petty kings would often fight one another, sometimes even at raiding hotspots, in dispute of who gets what loot, a perfect scene for settling feuds. An exact picture of this era cannot be properly mapped, as the Norse did not maintain consistent records. Although the scribes of Sweden began writing in Greek as early as 830, the petty lords of Norway refused the adoption of writing and record keeping, with the common policy being to burn or deface any writings that did materialize, barring, of course, the use of runic writing in relevant circumstances. The complex tapestry of wars, conquests, and betrayals have since been watered down into Christian accounts of events which had transpired centuries prior. The intricacies of the era forever lost to time. There are exceptions, wherein we have significantly stronger evidence of particular events in Norway, though still skewed as these accounts were written by the Norseman's enemy, Christendom. There was definitely a Jarl Vold, likely hailing from what we know as Trondheim, who laid scourge upon the Pictish fortress of Kellegron near what we know as Inverness in Scotland, sometime in the 830s. A warlord named Hvitor sacked Normandy in the 850s. But perhaps the most notable was the shield maiden Sigfriga, who seized power from her Jarl in the 860s and led conquests to unite many of the southern kingdoms of Norway. After, she led an infamous raid on Dublin in 875, for which there are plentiful primary accounts. At the time, Dublin was without its army. A competent garrison was in place as Ard Rianik was campaigning in Pictland, but it was not enough to prepare for the massive army of Norsemen. Led by Sigfriga and comprised mainly of militiamen from Rogaland, the raid was a success, with one of the 4 Celtic storehouses in the city being broken into and looted by the raiders. Anik responded to this by declaring a comprehensive reconstruction plan. Every soldier amidst his levies and his vassals' armies were to carry stones or bricks from Pictland back to Dublin, whereupon they would deposit their cargo to the stonemasons in exchange for a royal voucher that ensured they would be paid a sizable wage for every piece gathered. These pieces were then put towards a project to erect Roman walls around Dublin. There were several problems with this entire plan. First, the builders did not actually study or even see Roman walls before, so the results were functional but suboptimal. Second, the wage per piece system used simplistic and hastily scribbled handwritten notes without a royal seal, as the declaration happened too suddenly for a task force of scribes to be arranged. Thus, they were prone to forgery, which 2 brothers of the Wakalida clan of Connacht exploited, setting up a racket that almost drained another Dublin storehouse. Anik responded to this by marching to Connacht and sacking the Wakalida estate despite their concession to allow Anik inside. He rounded up, imprisoned, and executed a number of clansmen, even though only 2 were involved. This act of aggression inspired the Wakalida to raise an army to rebel against Anik, which became the focal conflict for the following year. After the Wakalida clan was forced to capitulate, Anik seized their lands and kicked them the Wales penniless. He then returned to the campaign on Pictland, which wrapped up in 879, and resulted in the formation of the Celtic Empire. If this tangent seems a little too distant from the topic, I'll just say this. Remember the Wakalida. They're important later. Meanwhile, upon returning to her home village, Sigfriga was assassinated by one of her lovers. Frustrated that he could not have her all to himself, her family, consisting of her sister and her sister's children, were outlawed and fled, attempting to set up in Shetland and Orkney before being driven farther out due to run-ins with raiding parties who would see them dead given the chance. Ultimately, via a twist of fate, they discovered what we know as Iceland, at the time uninhabited. We don't know what happened between then and 906. In 906, an ambitious young Viking from Iceland named Rolf, a grandnephew of Sigfriga's, mounted an attempted raid on Dublin. Disconnected from Norway, neither he nor his host heard the rumors of the city being surrounded by grand, impenetrable walls, so he figured going after his great-aunt's prize would be an easy target. It was, of course, not so, but when news of incoming ships arrived on the desk of Ardri Kilboth, he was struck with an idea. He rounded up his most elite and experienced warriors and had them dress as common folk to wander the streets of Dublin, whereupon he allowed Rolf to enter the city in a controlled pace. As expected, Rolf took the commoners as slaves, citing their impressive bulk and muscle mass, then left. The soldiers in disguise examined the method by which the Norsemen travel and memorized the routes taken in the transit to Iceland. Upon reaching the island, the soldiers cornered Rolf and stole his one ship to return to Dublin. Kilboth was so thoroughly impressed by the soldiers that he actually requested they do not embark on the follow-up raid on Iceland, as he wished for them to remain in Dublin and train the next generation of soldiers in their skills. Roughly half of the 12-man unit agreed, while the others insisted on participating. Kilboth then organized a fleet carrying levies to follow the stolen ship back to Iceland, whereupon he set the vessel ablaze as a symbol to Rolf. The following siege was a bloodbath. Rolf's village did not have walls or much else in the way of defensive structures. The destruction of Rolf's kingdom spelt disaster for Scandinavia. Norwegian kings got word and immediately suggested a sweeping alliance to raid Ireland. However, the motion was abandoned when the primary proponent of the advance, Ingjald of Trøndelag, was assassinated by spies sent by rivals in what we know as Bergen. Ingjald was a controversial figure in Norway and had been in hiding, ruling from the shadows ever since he cheated in personal combat with Birki of Bergen. Spearheading this movement to invade Ireland brought him out of hiding, ripe for assassination. The remaining petty kings contacted Sigtuna to ask for assistance in swarming and sacking Ireland, but received no response, because Sweden had just undergone a major regime change when the Scyldings were forced out of the realm by a charismatic slave rebel from the Ridala Peninsula in Estonia, named Rahuleid, supported by the Vedel clan. Rahuleid, hailing from farther into the Baltosphere, had little care for the British Isles and preferred to focus on sacking the Rus. Left with no leader and no allies, the Norwegian kings all agreed to forget about a swarm invasion further spurned by Rolf's controversial heritage. Raids still continued, but Dublin, and now even Loch Garman, was a strenuous challenge to sack. Kilboth is often remembered as one of the shrewdest Ardri to rule the Celtic Empire due to his impressive subversions against Norse raids. His tactics notably impressed a young man named Talorcan, a relative of his. Sweden was ripping itself apart after the Vedel clan toppled the Ridala regime in 923, and Norway could never seem to hold itself together. Then, in 928, a new Ardri was installed, following the death of Njalan, who replaced Kilboth a decade prior. This new Ardri was named Talorcan, and Talorcan had a vision. A world in which the Norse could not live in heathenry and commit raids, because they would not exist.